Everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to do a video on the Acura CL behind me. After we started driving it for the first couple times, we realized that we had a power steering system leak. We were able to pinpoint that leak to the pinion seal on top of the rack. Now I will note that you can have multitude of seal failures with your rack, so just because ours was at the pinion seal doesn't mean that there isn't leaks elsewhere that could occur. The power steering system is under high pressure from the pump. And as a previous video, we pointed out that you can have a leak at that pump and those pumps can be rebuilt, or you can have a leak at the high pressure hose and that hose might need to be replaced. But our leak specifically was at the pinion seal, and so we went ahead and replaced the rack on this car. We'll go ahead and take you through that process and show you how to do that and the little tips and tricks along the way. I will note that this is going to be a unique format. We're going to try something new here in our DIY videos to see how that goes. So bear with us and let's go ahead and get into the video. All right, let's go over the parts that you'll need to do this job. So you will need exhaust gaskets because we are going to drop the J-pipe on the exhaust to get the rack out, and you'll want to re-gasket it once you go to reinstall the J-pipe. Now my setup is a bit unique in that I have a Comptech exhaust, so my gaskets may not be the gaskets you need if you're running an OEM setup or a different J-pipe in general. So just take note of that. These are specific for my application, but you will need those. Next, you'll probably want to consider replacing your bushing for the power steering rack. There is one bushing, a cushioning bushing, if you will, for the rack, and that is the part number for it from Honda. Next, this is more of a recommendation, but I'm going to strongly advocate that you consider this. This is a power steering fluid filter, and we'll go over where that gets installed. But if you're looking for this, that's the part number, and it'll relate to where I install it. Next, you're going to need a couple bottles of power steering fluid, and if you're working on an Acura Honda, you likely know that you need Honda specific formulated power steering fluid. So I have both here. You could use the company here, Mitsu, if you want to save a couple bucks. It is the same as the genuine Honda power steering fluid. This is the OEM supplier for that fluid. So I have both. I'm going to need a couple bottles of that. We're going to start with draining out or flushing out all the old fluid, and so you will need to refill it. Plus, upon startup, that new rack is going to require fluid to go into it since it's empty, and you'll need to refill your reservoir. Next, you're going to need your power steering rack. Your power steering rack is likely going to be remanufactured at this point in time because you can't get OEM anymore, and if you do get OEM, it's likely going to be remanufactured anyways. But the important thing to note here is that power steering racks are specific to the CL or TL that you're working on. So if you have a base model versus a Type S, the base model has a different steering ratio than the Type S variant. The Type S variant, I believe, is 2.8 turns versus maybe 3.4 or 3.6 on the non-Type S. So make sure you get the specific rack for your application. If you had a base and you were looking to maybe liven up your steering, maybe you could upgrade to a Type S steering rack. Something to consider anyways. Just make sure that you do your homework before you purchase it. Now, I'm using a Maval power steering rack, so that's M-A-V-A-L, and that's after doing some research to understand that they have the fewest number of remanufactured defects per 1,000 units. And that's what I really wanted to focus on. If I can't get OEM, I need to find a high quality manufacturer for remanufacturing, and that is going to be Maval for my case, because they have the lowest number of defects. So that means out of how many consumers 1,000 racks had been purchased, only one out of those 1,000 racks ended up being returned. So 1 in 1,000 is pretty good. So I'm hoping that this rack will serve us well. It looks pretty good just from the naked eye, just doing a quick glance, and they give you good instructions here to go by. So we're going to go ahead and get going on this installation, but that's what you need to get the job done. I suppose I should also note that this is a perfect time to replace your outer tire rods um, if you're going to go ahead and do this. So mine are brand new, that's why you don't see me showing that part. But if you had older ones, since you have to install them on the ends here, and you're going to have to remove your old ones anyways with the old rack, might as well get new ones if yours are worn and tired. So something to think about. They do supply inner tie rods here for the power steering rack when you purchase it. As you can see, it's pre-installed, so no need to do that, but something to consider anyways. And so we get started on our work. Here you can see we've got our project underway by going ahead and sucking out some of the old power steering fluid. This is part of that flush I mentioned on the front end. The whole point is that you want to remove any particles that may contaminate your new rack. And by doing this, we're ensuring that our new fluid will have a chance to circulate through the new rack and not contaminate. So however which way you would like to do this, you can go ahead and drain it, or you can do what I'm doing here, which is essentially extracting that fluid. Next, you're going to want to go ahead and loosen up the lug nuts on your wheels and place a jack underneath the vehicle. Once you place the jack underneath the vehicle, you want to make sure that you support the vehicle safely, as you're going to be underneath the vehicle for prolonged periods of time working on getting the power steering rack out. Here I'm just using my jack to go ahead on a center point to jack the car up. Next, I'll go ahead and place jack stands underneath the car for support. Before removing your wheel, make sure that you center the steering wheel so that it will have a point of center reference when you go ahead and install the rack. Next, you can remove your lug nuts and remove your wheels. With the wheel removed, you can now loosen up the outer tie rod locking nut as shown here and start to loosen up the castle nut on your outer tie rod joint. You should be able to remove this by removing a cotter pin and then using a 17mm wrench on the castle nut. For the locking nut, that may vary, but it should be a 19mm if you're using an OEM rack currently. If you have a reman rack, that nut may vary in size, so just be aware that that nut may be smaller or larger depending on the current rack that's in it. Next, you're going to want to separate the ball joint from the knuckle. Here you can see that I'm using a ball joint separator to install into that area because I want to protect the boot. You can also use a pickle fork. A pickle fork will likely rip the boot, but if you're going to be replacing your outer tie rod anyways, that shouldn't really matter. With the outer tie rod separated from the knuckle, you can spin off the outer tie rod from the inner tie rod joint. This is a point where your alignment is going to be messed with, so you want to make sure that you can either take an approximate measurement, or as you see here in just a second, I'm going to show you how I just locked in with a couple large zip ties. This allowed me to get an approximate alignment to start with, and you'll want to note that you'll have to get a full alignment once you're done with the work. Next, hopping into the car underneath the steering wheel, you're going to want to release the cover on the column. There are two clips, one located at the top, one located at the bottom. Both of these need to be removed so that you can remove the plastic shield. Next, you're going to want to remove these plastic fasteners that hold the cover onto the firewall. They just spin off in a counterclockwise, and once you go to reinstall them, they push back on. So very simple work here. With the cover removed, you'll want to loosen up the two 10mm nuts located here. With the nuts loosened, you can slide off the knuckle and release it from the steering. A bit of a pro tip here on the hydraulic lines that lead to the rack. You have two. You have one that is high pressure in and one that you have that is low pressure out. I use a flared crowfoot with an extension to reach in, and that allows me to go ahead and break the nuts located on the hydraulic lines. Once you have the lines loosened, you want to make sure that you have a pan underneath to catch any fluid. Next, you want to locate the 10mm bolt that holds the high pressure line onto the subframe, which is located behind the steering rack right here. There's also a plastic clip for the other line that you'll need to loosen so that you can make enough room to get your hands in there and remove the rack. Next, you want to go underneath the car and remove the bolts that hold on the stiffener to the power steering rack. These bolts are specific to their location, so make sure you denote those. Additionally, next you'll want to remove the J-pipe. To do that, you'll want to remove the bolts joining the J-pipe to the catalytic converter and to the headers located on both the front and the back side of the engine. With your J-pipe removed, now you can locate the next bracket, which is located right here. This bracket has 3 bolts that need to be removed. Additionally, on the right hand side, you'll notice that there is a bushing. This bushing is held on with 2 bolts and can be removed at this time. At this point, the steering rack should be completely separated from the vehicle. Make sure that you push on the driver's side inner tie rod so that it pushes in, making removal easier. This will allow you to slide the rack out and remove it completely from the vehicle. Here you can see the steering rack completely removed from the vehicle, and you can note that the passenger side is fully extended while the driver's side is pulled in. That makes this job much easier to get the rack out, allowing you not to have to drop the subframe in any way. Next, you want to prep the new rack by making a mark of reference on center. Most racks are shipped to consumers at center. So just go ahead and double check that by making a permanent Sharpie mark on your pinion and going ahead and turning that from side to side, counting the rotations and allowing you to see whether the steering rack was truly centered. If it's not, now's the time to go ahead and center it by counting the rotations and marking the reference points to where it lands. Once you find out where center mark is on your steering rack, you're going to want to pull in the driver's side inner tie rod like we did with the removal to make sure that you can install the rack very easily without having to adjust the subframe. So here I am adjusting that inner tie rod to make installation easier. Next, I'm going to install the bushing, which will allow me to place the bushing in the correct spot before I go ahead and put the rack into the car. Additionally, I'll take the driver's side inner tie rod and point it upwards so that I can clear the subframe without issue. Next, with a couple bolts holding on the rack to the car, you'll want to make sure that you can then point the steering rack recentered into the vehicle and use your reference mark. Here I'm using a couple of pliers to just lightly turn that driver's side inner tie rod to center location. This will then be verified at the top side so that I can make sure that I am centered with my rack before reconnecting it to the steering column. From here, installation is pretty much as reverse. You want to make sure that you reinstall your stiffening brackets to 32 pound-feet of torque and locate the 10mm bolts that hold on the high pressure lines, reinstalling the high pressure lines, and relocating your outer tie rods. Once those are complete and you have everything connected to the outside of the car, you can jump into the inside of the car and reconnect the steering column. Next, if you're following my recommendation to install an inline filter, you can locate the return hose here, which will allow you to install a 3/8 filter to your reservoir. Once everything is reconnected and you have everything ready to go, you can install fresh fluid and start the engine for the first time. Make sure that you monitor the fluid for that first start, as new fluid will get sucked in rapidly. You should then immediately turn off the engine and install more fluid and top off. At this point, you want to make sure that you rotate the wheels from left to right on a new start to make sure that you bleed out any air in the lines. This will allow you to avoid dead spots when it's time to take the car out for that first drive. Bleeding air out is an essential process, so don't overlook it, because you'll end up having a more difficult time once you start driving the car if you don't. Once you check for any leaks in the power steering system, you can go ahead and reinstall your wheels. Go ahead and jack your car up and remove it from the stands, making sure to torque down your wheels to 95 foot-pounds and rechecking them after your first drive. If everything checks out and you're ready to go, you can go ahead and take it out for your first drive. And, well, we hope you liked this video. It was a different format for us. Hopefully that got to the point and made it easier for you to follow the steps. Now, I will note that if you have an Acura TL or Acura CL that has an automatic transmission, you will have the added step of removing the gear selector cable. Now, since we don't have an automatic version, we couldn't show you that, but if you watch other DIY videos, you can see how they do that. What I will caution you is, when you watch those other videos and you see them removing the subframe or lowering the subframe to get that power steering rack out, you do not have to do that. If you go ahead and push in that driver's side inner tie rod and point it upwards, you should be able to then move the rack out and drop that section down and move it back towards the driver's side, allowing you to easily remove the rack without uh, lowering the subframe or removing the subframe, if videos are saying that. So if you like this content and you liked our format, please go ahead and like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one.